At dawn on the 15th of June, 1944, hundreds of American landing craft edged towards the southern shores of Saipan. The men aboard had been briefed, armed, and packed shoulder to shoulder into steel boats. Ahead lay a stretch of sand that the Japanese had transformed into a killing ground. For days, the island had been shelled without pause. Battleships offshore had pounded coastal defences, and carrier aircraft had strafed bunkers and command posts. From above, Saipan may have looked like it was already subdued, but those who would soon set foot on the island knew better. The defenders were not only dug in, they were determined to fight to the last man. Saipan was more than just another island. Its capture would place American bombers within direct range of the Japanese home islands for the first time in the war. It was part of an American push through the Central Pacific, aimed at bringing Japan to its knees. For the Japanese, losing Saipan would mean more than just defeat. It would signal the vulnerability of the empire itself. Over the next 3 weeks, the fighting would be relentless. Cave networks, jungle thickets, fortified ridgelines, each would become the scenes of close quarters combat. For Japanese troops, surrender was not an option, and for many civilians caught in the middle, the consequences would be tragic. It was a battle that would claim tens of thousands of lives, bring down a government in Tokyo, and in its final hours would see one of the largest suicide charges of the war, a last act of defiance from an enemy pushed to the brink. In this episode, we will explore how the Battle of Saipan unfolded, from the planning and landings to the desperate final defense. Welcome to Wars of the World. In December 1941, war came crashing down over Pearl Harbor, changing the course of history forever. Japanese pilots, flying from 6 aircraft carriers, descended with terrifying efficiency. They destroyed more than 180 aircraft, sunk or damaged 8 battleships, and killed over 2,400 American servicemen and civilians. The following day, the US Congress declared war, sweeping the United States into a conflict fought across the globe, with theaters of war focused in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. America faced a dilemma. Should it primarily focus on Europe, where Hitler's war machine was raging, or commit fully to freeing the Pacific from Japanese dominance? Under the Europe First doctrine, the Allies aimed to defeat Germany before turning full strength to Japan. But in practice, the Pacific theater was also accelerating with brutal ferocity. This led to a strategy known as island hopping. Rather than assaulting every Japanese-held outpost, American forces would bypass heavily fortified islands in favor of more weakly defended positions, leapfrogging across the Pacific to reach Japan more efficiently. It was a plan born of necessity, logistics, and the urgent need to limit casualties, though this strategy would teach several bloody lessons. On Guadalcanal from January 1943, US Marines and soldiers struggled to hold and eventually push back the entrenched Japanese troops, with this assault being so difficult that it took 7 months of air, sea and ground combat to secure the island. Then came Tarawa in November 1943, a tiny atoll where nearly 6,400 American, Japanese and Korean lives were lost in just 3 days. Tarawa taught a brutal truth. Entrenched defenders, even on small islands, could impose a horrific cost. By early 1944, the next objective lay much deeper into the Pacific, with the Marshall Islands of Kwajalein and Eniwetok falling in January to February, opening a path farther west. From there, only the Marianas remained, an archipelago that represented a gateway to Japan itself. Capturing Saipan, Tinian, and Guam would bring American heavy bombers, most notably the new B-29 Superfortress, within 1,500 miles of Tokyo, enabling a strategic bombing campaign that the Japanese mainland had never faced before. What made this moment particularly dramatic was the timing itself. On the 6th of June 1944, just 9 days before the assault on Saipan, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the D-Day landings. In Europe, the Second Front was finally broken. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, yet another colossal amphibious assault was already in motion. A US planner at the time reportedly observed, quote, "It was like fighting 2 wars at once, but then we were doing just that." End quote. The focus on Saipan revealed just how global and interconnected this contest had become. A war of ships and soldiers, strategy and sacrifice, tactics and technology. And yet, for all the planning and momentum, few imagined what the Battle of Saipan would unleash. A battle of fire and death, on land, at sea, and in the skies above. By early 1944, the Allies had set their sights firmly on the Mariana Islands, and none more crucial than Saipan. The plan, codenamed Operation Forager, was simple in ambition, yet monumental in scope. Seize Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, build airfields for the new B-29 Superfortresses, giving the US range of Tokyo, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima, and to strike at the heart of Japan. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz issued final orders in March, and days later, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the 5th Fleet, began assembling the greatest armada that the Pacific had ever seen. Spruance marshaled nearly 600 warships. From mighty battleships to nimble destroyers, he was accompanied by 15 fleet carriers and hundreds of escort vessels. The skies were dominated by Task Force 58, with F-6F Hellcats and SB-2C Helldivers preparing for close air support. On the decks below them, Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith commanded the V Amphibious Corps, marshalling more than 127,000 Marines and soldiers. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, supported by the Army's 27th Infantry Division in reserve. The scale of equipment was unprecedented. 150 tanks, most of them Shermans, some equipped with flamethrowers, hundreds of landing craft, and months of rations, ammunition, and fuel, all of it stockpiled and rehearsed for precise timing. Holland Smith had long championed the practice of rigorous amphibious training and planning, and this was his moment. He famously had insisted on perfect coordination between sea, land, and air forces. Opposing them was a resolute, if outnumbered, Japanese garrison, under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, supported by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Roughly 31,600 troops, including 6,000 Navy personnel, were manning the island's defences. Over the preceding months, Saito's men had carved caves into the volcanic ridges, built concrete bunkers, camouflaged gun pits, and tunneled deep into the rocky interior. Their aim was clear: draw the Americans inland, force them into cave-to-cave combat, and to bleed them dry. In the days before the landings commenced, naval and air planners debated how much firepower to launch at the island. 2-day bombardment schedules were set. Battleships would fire at extreme range, carriers would deliver airstrikes, and destroyers would probe their defences. But while an immense quantity of bombs and artillery rained down on the island, questions arose about its effectiveness. As historian Robert A. Rosenthal noted, quote, 12,000 tons of naval ordnance was fired, but did little to soften up Japanese pillboxes by the time the Marines landed. End quote. The caves and bunkers, hidden beneath the canopy and rock, were designed to withstand just this kind of pounding. However, the bombardment would also serve another purpose: to sow chaos and destroy communications. As pre-invasion days passed, the Armada flexed its muscles. Carriers launched wave after wave of Hellcats, while cruisers and destroyers rehearsed fire missions. In the meantime, the Japanese command hardened its resolve. News from Tokyo urged unity and sacrifice. Admiral Nagumo had steeled his men with phrases echoing Admiral Togo's defiance at Tsushima. Quote, "The fate of the Empire rests upon this single battle." End quote. Saito issued orders to his officers: allow no American beachhead to grow. All civilians were to be prepared to resist, or worse, to follow them in death. For the Americans, no detail was overlooked. Landing charts were studied aboard ship, replica beaches practiced on, tide tables calculated. Every factor weighed to a precision designed to reduce confusion on the morning of June 15th. Spruance offered a final note on intent. Plans were detailed, but the man on the spot must act on his own initiative if the conditions changed. For both sides, the atmosphere was tense, as the scene was set for the battle on Saipan to unfold. Decisions made on a hillside, in a cave, or at sea would determine who held the island and whether it would serve as a launch pad for America's bombers, or would become just another bloody battlefield in the Pacific. The morning of June 15th, 1944 began in darkness and tension. As the horizon lightened, nearly 600 ships bristled off the west coast of Saipan. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, known as Terrible Turner for his strict discipline and unwavering focus, was the overall commander of the amphibious forces during the Marianas operation, having previously orchestrated landings at Guadalcanal and Tarawa. It was under his command that the Saipan assault was launched, with the order, "Land the landing force." At 0840, hundreds of tracked landing vehicles, known as LVTs, and Higgins boats surged forward, cutting through coral reefs in a display both brutal and awe-inspiring. On board the landing craft, 8,000 Marines from 2nd and 4th Divisions, backed by the 27th Infantry Division, braced for impact. Shells streaked overhead as naval gunfire and carrier aircraft prepared a deadly welcome. Moments later, Japanese artillery and machine guns erupted from concealed clifftop bunkers and pillboxes. Daly, a Marine from the 25th Regiment, recalled stepping off his LVT into a nightmare of coral and blood. Quote, "Bodies lying in mangled and grotesque positions, the acrid smell of high explosives." End quote. By mid-morning, around 20,000 American troops had reached the beaches, pushing inland beyond the coral rim under a torrent of enemy fire, with sniper bullets and mortar bursts striking around them. Captain Sutphin was one of the naval officers responsible for coordinating landing craft and logistical supply during the assault. He defied death by running back and forth to the beaches to land troops, ammunition, water, food, and medical supplies. He steered his Higgins boat through the chaos, navigating razor-sharp reefs and dodging sniper fire, all while on bended knee, using the boat's steel plating as cover. At the same time, American engineers struggled to maintain the flow of men and materiel, improvising flags to guide boats through hidden channels at the reef's edge. Across the western shoreline, dubbed Yellow Beach, Green Beach, and Red Beach, the landings were a patchwork of heroism and horror. On Yellow Beach, LVTA flamethrower tanks spearheaded the assault, drawing enemy fire so that infantry could follow in relative safety. American snipers from atop coral ridges targeted the swampy tree lines beyond the beaches, getting an ominous preview of what lay ahead. By 0900, the beachhead was held, but not without cost. Nearly 2,000 US casualties had been sustained, but the gains were undeniable. Tanks and artillery crews fought through the reef passages to establish the perimeter needed for further advances. At Tanapag and Scarlet Beaches earlier that morning, faint landings had tied down elements of Saito's garrison, even though the Japanese quickly realized they were decoys. This diversion paid dividends, allowing American forces to consolidate their foothold, with fewer direct clashes during those critical first hours. Once the beachheads were secure, the naval air and gunfire support shifted focus to inland targets. Carrier-based Hellcats and Helldivers strafed known bunkers, while battleships opened fire on the ridgelines overlooking the beaches, especially Hill 500 at the base of Mount Topachau. But Japanese defenders were masters of camouflage. Many pillboxes remained intact, killing or wounding troops hours after the bombardment had ceased. As day turned into evening, landing craft continued the grim round trip under the cover of darkness. Captain Sutphin labelled the night cycle routine as hellish. Sound sleep was unknown as Higgins boats defended themselves, being wary of suicide boats and Japanese swimmers. Despite the fatigue and fear, 20,000 US troops remained ashore by nightfall. In the command post, Holland Smith gathered reports. Beachhead secure, but resistance heavier than expected. Intelligence indicated that Saito had shifted his defenders inland, refusing to contest the beaches and choosing terrain where concealment and cave systems would favour his men. By the night's end, the Allies held a tenuous but vital foothold, and as dawn approached, battalions dug in, engineers readied landing zones, and artillery units prepared to push forward. The stage was set. Over the coming days, every inch of the island would need to be fought for, and the quiet triumph of the landing would give way to pitched struggle in the jungle and the caves hidden within. The struggle for Saipan did not rest after the first morning's landings. On June 16th, as US forces pressed inland beyond the beaches, the Japanese launched a powerful nighttime counterattack against the 6th and 4th Marine Divisions. Long columns of infantry and tanks rolled down the coastal road at Garapan, attempting to shatter American advance lines before they could dig in. At 0200 hours, the 6th Marines on the left flank were hit by a savage onslaught. Enemy infantry, supported by tanks and guided by bugle calls and raised banners, thundered forwards, illuminated under starshell flares. However, the strike failed decisively, with 5-inch naval guns on destroyers and shore-based machine guns cutting the Japanese down. By dawn, almost 700 Japanese soldiers lay dead to the north of their lines. That same night, the 4th Marine Division, firmly entrenched to the south, withstood probing attacks and artillery barrages. Naval fire and 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers repelled every Japanese thrust. The result was stunned Japanese forces, little to show for their effort, and a reinforced American beachhead. Through to the 17th, focus sharpened on Aslito airfield. 4 M4 Sherman tanks of the 4th Tank Battalion spearheaded the advance, only to be halted by Japanese fire. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Howard McCard was part of this action, cut off from the other units of his platoon when his tank was disabled by enemy fire. McCard carried on resolutely, bringing all the tank's weapons to bear on the enemy until the severity of the hostile fire caused him to order his crew out of the escape hatch. McCard stayed behind, exhausting his supply of hand grenades to aid in his crew's retreat. Wounded, McCard dismantled one of the tank's machine guns. Facing the oncoming Japanese alone, he fired on their position. His body would later be found on the battlefield beside 16 fallen Japanese soldiers. Robert McCard was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor on April 10, 1945. By evening, with the arrival of the Army's 27th Infantry Division under reserve orders from Lieutenant General Howland Mad Smith, Marines and soldiers encircled the airfield, but halted their advance until dawn. Then came June 18th, when as many as 50,000 US troops secured Aslito, renamed to Isley Field, and began converting it into a forward airbase. On that same day, naval planners knew a decisive encounter loomed at sea. The Japanese Operation Eigo fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, was headed towards the Marianas in a last-ditch attempt to beat back the invasion. As American forces consolidated on the ground, a clash would unfold overhead and offshore that would decide control of the skies, and perhaps the island of Saipan itself. As the battle on Saipan raged, another confrontation was brewing offshore. The Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing a decisive strike, which would lead to the largest carrier-to-carrier battle in history. At sea, Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa marshaled Japan's remaining carrier fleet, including the ships Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio, backed by cruiser and destroyer screens. Their mission was to intercept Task Force 58 and blunt the American advance before their newly captured airfield could be used to support operations. Across the radio, Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher were preparing their own response, an unprecedented aerial counter. On June 19th, under Spruance's direction, Task Force 58 launched wave upon wave of F-6F Hellcats, SB-2C Helldivers, and TBM Avengers from the fleet carriers, Enterprise, Essex, and Lexington, among others. In total, around 1,300 carrier aircraft faced Japan's roughly 430 planes, launched across 4 successive waves. The Hellcat was a game-changer. Powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, armoured and packing 6 50 caliber aircraft machine guns, its 380 mph top speed and 37,300 foot ceiling dwarfed the aging Mitsubishi A6M-0 used by the Japanese. With a rugged carrier-hardened design and top-tier pilot training, the Hellcat claimed 75% of the US Navy's Pacific victories, achieving a 19-to-1 kill ratio. Japanese aviators largely flew the A6M-0, a nimble long-range fighter from the early war period, but their light armour and lack of radar left them vulnerable. Their replacements were often green pilots rushed into combat after a year of attrition. When the first wave of Japanese aircraft came within range, US radar-equipped Hellcats were already airborne. Mitcher famously recalled, quote, "It was just like a turkey shoot." End quote. By the day's end, American crews claimed approximately 380 enemy planes, while US losses numbered only 123 aircraft, with less than 24 being Hellcats lost to combat. Meanwhile, the Japanese carriers were staggering. Taiho, flagship of the 1st Mobile Striking Force, was mortally damaged and then later sank, with carrier Shokaku also being sunk in the combat. Crucially, Japan's pool of experienced aviators, especially 22 of the 35 squadron commanders, had perished. Ozawa's planned decisive counterstroke had failed before it began. Back on Saipan, US ground commanders Smith, Holland, and Turner grew increasingly confident. Naval gunfire support and air cover kept Japanese interception at bay. American transports continued to unload thousands of men and tons of supplies, even as the Pacific skies erupted in gunfire and flame. The second day, June 20th, saw further Japanese air sorties, again repelled with minimal losses. By the evening, Tokyo ordered a retreat. Ozawa's fleet disengaged and withdrew to the north. With the naval threat shattered and the beaches firmly in American hands, the focus shifted inland. What followed was a brutal slog, yard by yard, ridge by ridge, through some of the most unforgiving terrain and tenacious resistance that the Marines and Army troops had yet encountered. The island's mountainous spine runs like a jagged backbone down its centre, dominated by the volcanic heights of Mount Topachau, rising up over 1,500 feet. From this position, the Japanese could observe almost the entire southern half of Saipan, and so it had to be taken. On the 22nd of June, the American 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, supported by the 27th Infantry Division, launched a combined assault. The climb was steep, and the ground loose with volcanic dust between tall, razor-sharp cane fields and Japanese snipers that had embedded themselves among the rocks and crevices. Every step upwards came under fire. One platoon leader wrote, quote, "It was the same old story. In every field the company would lose a man or two. The Jap snipers dug in so deeply it was impossible to locate them before they fired." End quote. Mount Topachau became the campaign's focal point, with US intelligence estimating some 15,000 Japanese defenders were holding entrenched positions. On June 25th, Marines began the ascent, supported by a coordinated barrage of 155mm howitzers, naval gunfire, P-47 fighter bombers, which were now flying out of Aslito, and tank-mounted flamethrowers, known as Satans. By June 30th, American forces had seized Mount Topachau, depriving the Japanese of their primary observation point. The summit offered a panoramic view of the ravaged island, a bitter prize won at a terrible cost. Then, pushing to the north, the Americans entered Garapan, Saipan's capital, and the villages nearby. The house-to-house combat was brutal. Japanese defenders had fortified schools, churches, and even hospitals, turning the entire city into a death trap. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, fled north in desperation, many having been told by Japanese propaganda of the bloodthirsty and savage nature of the American fighters, that all that awaited them was death, torture, and rape. Some hid in caves, praying to be spared, while others, gripped by fear, fled to the cliffs above Marpy Point Field, now known as Suicide Cliff, where they flung themselves down. They were frightened less by death than capture by American hands. But in contradiction to the Japanese propaganda, some moments of humanity emerged from the fighting, such as the rescue of a wounded Japanese child by a Marine patrol, an image captured by life photographer Peter Stackpole. Another photographer for life, Eugene Smith, noted the compassion shown by the US soldiers. Quote, "The soldiers who had lost so many comrades due to the same caves now showered them, especially the kids, with candy or anything else that they had. It was a magnificent example of fair play and lack of blinding hatred such as can overcome decency and reason. This was real Americanism." End quote. However, the battle was still ongoing, and the brutality of war continued to take its toll. To root out Japanese defenders hidden in the coral caves and bunkers that littered the northern part of the island, US forces employed tanks, flamethrowers, and bulldozers. It was warfare at its most primitive. Fire, earth, and steel forced men from hiding or buried them alive. The Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, clinging to every crevice as though the war's outcome depended on it. Despite being cut off from reinforcements, and with their naval support being destroyed, Japanese forces remained relentless. Their commanders had already accepted that Saipan could not be held, but they would make the Americans pay for every inch. From the beginning of July, the American lines pressed north towards the final cliffs, and with Japanese desperation reaching its peak, a final last-ditch plan was about to be put into motion. On the morning of July 7th, 1944, the Japanese forces on Saipan launched their final desperate attempt to repel the advancing American troops. This mass suicidal assault, known as a Banzai Charge, was the culmination of weeks of intense combat, and it marked the last significant organized resistance on the island. At approximately 3 AM, between 3,000 to 5,000 Japanese soldiers, including their wounded and support troops, assembled near Makunsha village before charging southwards across the Tanapag Plain towards the American positions held by the US Army's 27th Infantry Division. Armed with rifles, bayonets, swords, and improvised weapons, they overwhelmed several American positions in a frenzied assault. One rifleman recounted his vivid experience of the Banzai attacks while at Saipan. Quote, Whenever we cornered the enemy and there was no way out, we faced the dreaded Banzai attack. The 23rd Marines had a few of these during our Saipan adventure, as did all the other outfits. I dreaded these attacks, and yet welcomed them, which is quite a paradox. They generated a great deal of fear, but when it was over, that particular sector was Jap free. For hours, we could hear them preparing for their Banzai attack, as it was the end for them and they knew it. Because it was against their heritage, their training and their belief, they would not surrender. All that was left was a final charge, a pouring in of all their troops in one concentrated place, with their pledge to take as many of us with them as possible." End quote. While this rifleman prepared himself for the assault that he knew was coming, he could hear the enemy's yells and screams going on for hours, before finally a silence rang out, signaling the enemy's advance. Quote, "Suddenly, there is what sounded like 1,000 people screaming all at once, as a horde of madmen broke out from the darkness before us. Screams of Banzai filled the air, Japanese officers leading the devils from hell, their swords drawn and swishing in circles over their heads. Jap soldiers were following their leaders, firing their weapons at us and screaming Banzai as they charged toward us. Our weapons opened up. Our mortars and machine guns fired continually. No longer do they fire in bursts of 3 or 5. Belt after belt of ammunition goes through that gun, the gunner swinging the barrel left and right. Even though Jap bodies build up in front of us, they still charged us, running over their comrades' fallen bodies. The mortar tubes became so hot from the rapid fire, as did the machine gun barrels, that they could no longer be used. Bullets whiz around us, screams are deafening, the area reeks with death, and the smell of Japs and gunpowder permeate the air. Full of fear and hate, with the desire to kill, our enemy seems to us now to be a savage animal, a beast, a devil, not human at all, with the only thought is to kill, kill, kill. Finally, it ends." End quote. Another tale of heroism during this final Banzai charge is that of Captain Ben L. Salomon of the 27th Infantry Division. Originally a dentist, Salomon was serving as the surgeon from the 2nd Battalion when they were overwhelmed by the charging Japanese forces. His aid station was quickly filling with wounded within the first few minutes, but they wouldn't be the only ones barging into his tent. The Congressional Medal of Honor Society captures the moment when Captain Salomon put down his surgeon's tools to push back the enemy. Quote, "As the perimeter began to be overrun, it became increasingly difficult for Captain Salomon to work on the wounded. He then saw a Japanese soldier bayoneting one of the wounded soldiers lying near the tent. Firing from a squatting position, Captain Salomon quickly killed the enemy soldier. Then, as he turned his attention back to the wounded, 2 more Japanese soldiers appeared in front of the entrance of the tent. As these enemy soldiers were killed, 4 more crawled from under the tent walls. Rushing them, Captain Salomon kicked the knife out of the hand of one, shot another, and bayoneted a third. Captain Salomon butted the 4th enemy soldier in the stomach, and a wounded comrade then shot and killed the enemy soldier. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Captain Salomon ordered the wounded to make their way as best as they could back to the regimental aid station, while he attempted to hold off the enemy until they were clear. Captain Salomon then grabbed a rifle from one of the wounded and rushed out of the tent. After 4 men were killed while manning a machine gun, Captain Salomon took control of it. When his body was later found, 98 dead enemy soldiers were piled in front of his position." End quote. For his efforts, Captain Ben Salomon was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor almost 6 decades later, on May 1st, 2002. By mid-morning, the Japanese forces had been decimated. The US Army's 105th Infantry Regiment had suffered significant casualties, with nearly 406 being killed and an additional 512 being wounded. The Japanese losses, however, were even more staggering, with approximately 4,311 soldiers being killed during the assault. The remnants of the Japanese command, including General Yoshitsugu Saito, committed seppuku, a kind of ritual suicide reflecting the cultural and military ethos of fighting to the death rather than surrendering. In the aftermath of the charge, isolated pockets of Japanese soldiers continued to resist. However, these were small groups and their efforts were largely ineffective. One notable exception, however, was Captain Sakae Oba, who, along with 50 followers, continued to evade capture and fought on in the jungles of Saipan until their eventual surrender in December 1945, almost a year and a half later. By the 9th of July 1944, the island was declared secure. The American flag was raised over Saipan, symbolizing the end of major combat operations and a victory for the United States. The Battle of Saipan ended with a decisive American victory, but the cost was steep. By mid-July 1944, the island was fully under US control, providing a vital foothold deep in the Japanese-held Pacific. Saipan's capture not only broke the Japanese defensive perimeter, but also marked a turning point in the Pacific War's strategic landscape. One of Saipan's immediate values was its airfields, especially Aslito Airfield, renamed to Isley Field, which the US swiftly repaired and expanded. This allowed the deployment of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, which had the range to strike the Japanese home islands for the first time. Saipan thus became a launching pad for sustained aerial bombardment campaigns, directly threatening cities like Tokyo, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima. The neighboring island of Tinian, which was captured shortly after Saipan, would later serve as the base for the Enola Gay and Boxcar, the B-29s that would go on to drop the atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945. The human toll at the Battle of Saipan was devastating. Estimates vary, but approximately 3,426 US military personnel were killed, with over 13,000 being wounded. Japanese military losses were far greater, however, with around 29,000 soldiers perishing, many fighting to the death or committing suicide rather than surrendering. Tragically, tens of thousands of civilians also died, driven by wartime propaganda that portrayed American forces as brutal and cruel, leading to mass suicides at locations such as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. These civilian deaths remain one of the most harrowing aspects of the battle's legacy. Strategically, the loss at Saipan shook Japan to its core. The fall of the island exposed the vulnerability of the Japanese homeland and shattered confidence in the imperial leadership. In fact, this defeat triggered a political crisis in Tokyo, leading to the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his cabinet in 1944. Tojo had been a staunch advocate for continuing the war at all costs, and his ousting reflected the growing dissent within Japan's government regarding the bleak prospects of victory. The battle also had profound effects on both American and Japanese military thinking. For the US, Saipan reinforced the effectiveness of their amphibious island-hopping strategy, gradually bypassing heavily fortified islands to capture strategic bases closer to Japan. The brutal fighting experienced on Saipan also led to tactical and logistical improvements for future assaults, including Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Conversely, for the Japanese military, Saipan's loss led to a shift towards increasingly desperate defensive tactics. The large-scale Banzai charges and mass civilian suicides that were witnessed on Saipan were indicative of the growing willingness to fight to the last man, setting a grim tone for the battles to follow. Japan's military leadership recognized that conventional defense was faltering, and that future battles would be fought with fanatic resistance, even as defeat loomed. Historian John Keegan reflected on Saipan's significance, describing it as, quote, "a battle that marked the end of Japan's strategic initiative in the Pacific and the beginning of the end of the empire itself." End quote. The island stands as a stark symbol of the brutality of war and the immense sacrifices made on both sides. Saipan was far more than a battlefield. It was a strategic gateway, a political catalyst, and a grim lesson in the cost of total war. Its capture allowed the United States to bring the war to Japan's doorstep and to hasten the conflict's conclusion. Yet the human price paid remains a solemn reminder of the horrors endured during the Pacific Campaign.